So it's amazing to see such an audience and amazing attendance. Today is a big day for us because this launch and this book have been 4 years in the making. It's taken us 4 years to produce the handbook. It is, to some extent, a baby of COVID. And it's also, a baby, so to speak, of a lot of collective work and generous support from a number of supporters. So we're very keen today to give you a sneak preview into the foundational principles with my colleagues who wrote the foundations section of the handbook. Admittedly, this will only allow us to scratch the surface. So much in this book. And one of the things I'm most proud of is when I saw on the Amazon page that this book weighs 800 grams. So obviously, we will only give you a few grams of all the wisdom in this book. And I'll say this again at the end, there'll be other opportunities to meet, other webinars. And of course, there's the book itself, which now is open access, thanks to the generous support of the Porticus Foundation and the Mercator Foundation. So we're here today to celebrate this moment and to share some insights, few insights. Why this topic of collective intelligence and democracy? Well, like our good friend Helene Landemore says, one of the key reasons why democracy is being attacked, is suffering, is being questioned, challenged, is certainly because it's not tapping enough into the collective intelligence of our citizens. So we feel there's a real need behind this book, and that's why we want to disseminate it in so many ways. What is collective intelligence? Well, I'm sure if you're here, you have your understanding. This is the straightforward definition we give of collective intelligence in the handbook. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems, while collective intelligence is the ability of groups to outperform individuals in learning, decision-making, and problem-solving. And as our colleague Jeff, who's on the call, reminds us in your book, Big Mind, collective intelligence, if you look at the epistemology, is a very ethical term. It's about collective choice, about who we want to be with and what we want to do together. So there is a fundamental correspondence between collective intelligence and democracy that we feel is very important. And of course, collective intelligence is made possible because we all have some elements of knowledge, some gaps in our knowledge, and we make errors. But when you combine those together, we can produce that magic of groups outperforming individuals. So that's just to set the scene. What we're amazed to see is that there has been in recent years a wave of deliberative practices that is very exciting and is becoming more accepted in various ways around the world. We feel that the book we're sharing starting today is providing evidence of a new wave of practices involving citizens and beyond in various ways. And what we try to do with the book is to show what are the common principles behind these different approaches. Program for today's session, we're going to have a very quick presentation from each of the authors of the introductory chapters. There'll be Jeff on in neuroscience of government. What does looking at government as a brain suggest we could do? Lex on how CI has come a long way, looking at the past. I will myself talk a little bit about CI matters for public administration. Paulo Spada will tell us whether the promise of greater collective intelligence for governance is fulfilled. What is the impact? What can we see out there? And well, Karina will look at the future of collective intelligence. Then we will have a brief exercise. This is about collective intelligence after all, so we'll try and make it a little bit interactive. And then we'll wrap up and share some information about next events. So I'd like to introduce my fellow speakers for today's session. We have Karina, Dr. Karina Antonia Helene of the IT University of Copenhagen, one of the 3 co-editors of the book. Jeff Morgan, no need to present Jeff, a pioneer in this field, and a pioneer not just intellectually, but in terms of many things you've done and achieved. Paulo Spada of Southampton University, who among other chapters, wrote the one that we will be talking about in a moment on the impacts of collective intelligence. Dr. Lex Paulson, who heads, as I'm sure many of you know, the first school of collective intelligence with a postgraduate program on the topic, based in Morocco. And myself, founder of a consultancy based in Brussels, Democracy, and this not-for-profit really dedicated to sharing the knowledge in this handbook and beyond over the coming months. So very happy to be with you. So with that, we're going to dive into a quick sneak preview into some of the chapters. Again, it's a sneak preview. It's an invitation for you to dive into the book. The book is really written published by I dare say, prestigious academic publisher in a non-academic way. The chapters are short, concise. We've made great effort in making them well written with the help of all the contributors. So beyond what we're going to be presenting you, know that there are 36 case studies from around the world, from a range of contributors, academia, practitioners, really top-level contributors. And they're not all here, but some are here, and you will definitely be invited to chip in, colleagues. And they're not all on this slide. So without further ado, Jeff, you wrote a chapter about government as a brain. Can you enlighten us how that helps us think about how to take government and governance forward today?
Thanks to Stephen for pulling this all together. It's quite a complex task of collective intelligence assembly doing a book of this kind.
With Lex and with Karina.
And the dozens of others you just showed and today's event. So I'll be very brief. In a way, what my chapter is about is the two sort of twin dilemmas we have, I think, now in the 21st century. On the one hand, democracy clearly is still stuck in essentially 19th century models of periodic elections, parliaments, representatives, which feels quite out of sync with the 21st century world, where there's far more ways of tapping into citizen view, lived experience, ideas, and so on. But then related to that is the form of the state. So our modern democracy, in a sense, allied itself with the state as the means to achieve education, health, welfare, all these other things. And so you can't really separate the forms of democracy from the forms of the state. And yet they too, in many ways, don't tap into all of the available sources of intelligence which they could be using. And the structures are still also essentially 19th century silos. So I use this analogy of imagining if government was more like a brain, and indeed the whole of society was more like a brain, which could connect its observations, its creativity, its memory, its judgment, its wisdom in more systematic ways. What would that look like? And in a way, we've had quite an interesting sort of test case through the pandemic as governments tried to think and act in new ways, whether deciding on lockdowns and school closures or welfare for businesses and households. And I look at each of those dimensions of intelligence and how perhaps we're seeing them in novel ways. So on the one hand, there's data on things like infection levels, but there are also collective intelligence actions during the pandemic, like Zoe, which collected data from 4 million people gathering their symptoms. A lot of the discussion of mental health effects came from these bottom-up movements rather than classic top-down data collection by governments. The same is true of the models world. Lots of competing arguments about models, their flaws and their strengths. I look at the organization of creativity and innovation, which could be done in very classical ways, as with vaccines. But there were a number of exercises from Estonia and Germany and elsewhere using collective intelligence methods to tap into mass creativity. There's the harnessing of tacit knowledge of the frontline staff working on things, and many, many other aspects of this more systematic organization of intelligence. One of the things, in fact, I'm in Malmo at the moment, where there's about 1,000 people from European social services, ministers and others, and arguing that in each of these fields, we don't have them yet in governments, an integrated intelligence function, which can pull together collective intelligence, data, evidence, scientific knowledge in much more systematic ways to help solve problems. And I think that will become the future of governance. And that, of course, then integrates with all the experiments in democracy, citizens' assemblies and juries and participatory processes of all kinds, because those always need to tap into knowledge of all kinds. If you're looking at end of life, like the Citizens' Assembly in France, or climate change, you need to be drawing on highly complex scientific knowledge, technical knowledge, data, and so on, as well as your preferences and values and so on. And this is, in some ways, the design task of 21st century democracy, is how to do all of that well. Stephen was keen that we talked a little bit about AI. So it's a very quick comment on where I think AI is taking some of this debate. So for quite a few years, and I used, in my last job at Nesta, we used to run various funds on and experiments on combining AI and CI. And I think this is becoming increasingly prevalent, and including in democracy experiments like Taiwan and others, which use polis AI tools to help groups to understand their reasoning, to help move towards consensus and convergence. And my hope is we'll be able to use AI as a very powerful enhancement of democracy. And in fact, large language models make this much easier in many ways. The breakthroughs of GPT really could transform democracy for the better. I've been talking here about another aspect of that, which is the personal advisor, the PI, the co-pilots, which again are made possible by LLMs. And they potentially transform almost every aspect of education, of welfare, and health, combining the collective shared provision of services with, as it were, a guide, a navigator who can really help you make decisions as they get to know your preferences, your needs, your context, rather than being one size fits all. And I see that as another potential enhancement of democracy. And then a final example, which I mentioned briefly in the chapter, which I'm working at the moment in some Asian countries, is in relation to transform labor markets, where we can see millions of jobs being changed or destroyed by AI. How can we pull together all the data about current jobs, skills, pay levels, etc., the likely growth and decline of jobs in the next 5 or 10 years, and then turn that into tools to help individuals navigate their way through? Now, that has to be a grand collective project, is one which requires states to operate in ways they're not really used to working, including across departmental boundaries. And like so much in this space, it requires a combination of formal data and analytics, but also human judgment to make sense of that and then translate that into what should be, let's say, the curriculum of a secondary school to help children prepare for a world of GPT-24, whatever it may be. So my hope is that we will increasingly see, I sort of call it slightly flippantly, a neuroscience of the state and of democracy, thinking about how it thinks, how it remembers, how it reasons, how it makes judgments, how it observes, not just classic things like infection rates, but also things like loneliness and happiness and so on. And then how do we feed that knowledge back into practice? And a final request to many people on this call, is we do now have an academic collective intelligence journal published by ACM and SAGE. I'm one of the editors. I would really urge all of you to submit articles as we underpin, or as we really grow and strengthen the science, the underpinning science of how to use collective intelligence well to make our world a better place, and hopefully to reverse the recent decline of confidence in democracy, which is one of the most worrying features of the world of the 2020s. So hopefully, Stephen, that's just about in time. So I've overrun a tiny bit. I will shut up there.
Thank you, Jeff. Never enough of Jeff Morgan. No, that was very to the point. Thank you very much. And thank you also to Jerry Michalski and others contributing in the chat. Yes, memory is something that governments are not very good at. And you've developed the largest mind map in the world, mapping all your knowledge throughout your life. Quite amazing. So thinking of government through the key functions of the brain. Thank you, Jeff. Now, collective intelligence is a relatively recent scientific field. And Lex, you're going to tell us where we come from a wider perspective.
So on the one hand, the science of collective intelligence is relatively recent. The first, and Jeff gives a bit of a genealogy in his book, Big Mind. In my chapter, I try to build on that intellectual So as a science, an interdisciplinary science, this fusion of the kind of computer science side and the politics and democracy side is really relatively recent, just in the last 15 years or so. The use of collective intelligence as a term became popularized in computer science circles in the 80s and 90s, and more in democratic circles in the 2000s, with a really important contribution of a book co-edited by Helene Landemore and John Elster called Collective Wisdom, which some of the folks I think here present were contributors. So, but the idea, the practice of collective intelligence is as old as our species. And so I want to just give in three extremely short anecdotes, three kind of milestones in the history collective intelligence and democracy, both of which are ideas that in a sense post-dated the practice of democracy and the practice of intelligent collaboration happened far before we had names for them. Christopher Boehm here is an anthropologist at the University of California. Read the book Hierarchy in the Forest. It's one of the most interesting books on the early history of human politics, which could be called proto-democracy. And Boehm makes a really interesting argument. He says, look, if you compare humans to other primate species, most other primate species are strictly hierarchical. That is to say, if you look at chimpanzees, and there's a famous book by Frans de Waal, Chimpanzee Politics, which examines in detail how power dynamics work within populations of chimpanzees very vertically. There's an alpha. The men are much bigger than the women, so the men are in charge of everything. And who is in which position might switch, but the hierarchy itself doesn't change. But somewhere along the line in our evolution as a species, we developed the possibility of an egalitarian ethos. That is to say, of a set of norms, expectations, and values. Everybody was going to contribute to decisions that affected everybody. And Christopher Boehm thinks this was not a gradual development, but perhaps a sudden switch. What could have driven this switch, according to Christopher Boehm, from hierarchical dominant forms where a few strong individuals control all decisions and resources, what allowed that to change was the development of technologies and the development of our language. He estimates between 80 and 120,000 years ago, which allowed us tell stories about the past and make visions for the future. And those stories were a way of transmitting values, but also a way of setting norms. And invention of hunting spears, you had the ability for large groups of relatively weak people to team up and threaten the stronger outliers. And so, because, everyone has to sleep sometime. And so the bullies would become, in a sense, the potential victims if what they did in taking things for themselves was against the values and stories of the group. And so he calls this a reverse dominance hierarchy. This is basically the beginning of what will later, larger scale, become democracy, the ability for the weak to team up and rule over the strong, and many anthropologists today study the conditions by which egalitarianism can work in smaller scale societies. And what they all seem to say is that it works only by constant vigilance. There's neither a natural instinct democracy nor a natural instinct to be dominated or to dominate. Both of those things are present in almost all human societies, but the societies that choose a story of themselves that is based on sharing, that is based on participation, have to protect that ethos with creative rituals and practices and sanctions that allow the weak, the mass of the less strong, to continue to be able to dominate the few single strong people. And we see this dynamic all through human history, where single ambitious individuals, and it's still happening today, are constantly trying to amass more power. But what are the conditions by which the collective can continue to preserve its power? And Christopher Boehm thinks this dynamic has been a part of our human story for at least the last 100,000 years. Relatively recently, we jumped from the scale of living in groups of 20 to 150 to living in cities of many thousands of people. This was very recent. If you look at the last 5,000 years compared to the 100,000-year history of our species as anatomically modern human beings, we've lived in cities for a very short time, and really until the 20th century, most human beings didn't live in cities. But with the rise of cities, you had the possibility of collective action on a very large scale. And as some of us read in books by either David Graeber, David Wengrow, or Yuval Harari, or James Scott, or others, the rise of cities in most places seemed to lead to the rise of elites, dominating the distribution of resources, dominating the control of violence, dominating the control of stories, religious stories that justified elite rule. And one major outlier, and there's still a lot of debate about how common this was, one major outlier was the city of Athens. And what I think we lose in the modern conversation about democracy was how different and how radical a system Athens was, both at the time and compared to call, I think mistakenly, democracy today. As Jeff said, we have a very 19th century idea of democracy that's based around elections, political parties, and parliaments, whereas democracy in its original demokratia, the form of kratos to the demos, power to the people, was about direct participation. And so I think it's really useful to look at the mechanisms that underlie what I call the Athenian design. So we have two main principal decision-making bodies: the ecclesia, gathered on the side of the Acropolis, where somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 Athenian citizens out of we think around 50,000 total, would come together around once a month, more often as democracy progressed in the 5th and 4th century, and make collective decisions. Now, I'll say the obvious, right? Women were not invited, and they had slaves. Now, in that sense, the Athenians were totally the same as every other society, every other urban society on the planet at that point in history. So in that case, the Athenians were the same, and we should be a lot better. But what made Athenians different is the massive amount of power, decision-making power given to the average person. And in this case, the poor Athenian citizen had an equal right, what they called isagorewe, an equal right to participate. The law was expected to bind equally the rich and the poor. And the assembly was a place where any citizen could speak, any citizen could vote, and one man was worth one vote. So this was, I think, an analogy to some of the participatory democratic mechanisms that have been developed, especially, Porto Alegre, PB, and the rest, that invite everybody to come in, but end up having a balancing effect because there are more poor people than rich people. And then the second major institution in Athens was the council, the boule, which was essentially the collective brain that was on duty 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And this was chosen randomly. A group of 500 citizens chosen as a representative sample of the 10 civic tribes, which each of themselves were representatives of 3 different regions. So you had this idea, the modern idea of cognitive diversity, that the more diverse a crowd is, the smarter it can be. This was represented in both the principle of civic tribes and the principle of the lottery. And the lottery was and remains the democratic mechanism par excellence. Aristotle was the first to say elections are oligarchic. If you want to have a system where an elite rules, use elections. Whereas if you want to have a system that gives the power to the average citizen, you need a law. So this is where the deliberative practices of mini publics, deliberative polls, and citizens' assemblies reflect a second aspect of the Athenian design. But here's something that I think is critically important in this story. It wasn't just about what we would think of as the political bodies, the political institutions. It was the culture. And so from a young age, if you were an Athenian, you were participating through festivals, through local neighborhood assemblies, through juries, in learning how to think critically, learning about the stories of conflicts of values. This is what tragedy and comedy were invented to do and put on display. So all of these were participatory mechanisms that sat around the decision-making bodies and that gave citizens the chance to build their muscles, their civic muscles. And I think this is something we can't miss when it comes to democratic innovation today. It's not just about the decision-making bodies. It's about a culture of civic education and participation that goes on all year. Okay, so I'm just gonna leave you today with just two quotes. This is from Doug Engelbart, who was, in addition to coining the phrase collective IQ in the 1970s, was in his lab at Stanford the pioneers of the mouse, the hyperlink, the video conference. His online system NLS was the first director of traffic for what became the internet. And Doug Engelbart, whose name we don't know today because he didn't become a billionaire, says this: we need to become better at being humans. This is at the dawn of the digital age. Learning to use symbols and knowledge in new ways across groups, across cultures is a powerful, valuable, and very human goal. And it is also one that's obtainable if only we begin to open our minds to full, complete use of computers to augment our most human of capabilities, not replace, augment. One of the strongly held beliefs within the United States is to let the market decide. Well, whatever it is that the market knows, its knowledge is fundamentally conservative and that it only values what's available today. Markets are notoriously poor judges of value for things that are not currently being bought and sold. So this is why we know Steve Jobs and Bill Gates' names and not Doug Engelbart. But he was there at the beginning and saw the promise of the technology. And I would say Wikipedia is one of the best examples of the kinds of use of collective intelligence that Doug Engelbart dreamed of. And then this last final quote: one of the things we most often hear, and you'll see this in my chapter, is the idea that citizens are lazy, they're uninformed, they don't have the knowledge necessary. This was also said about African Americans throughout most of American history. This was an excuse not to let women vote, not to let Black people vote. Here was W.E.B. Du Bois' answer, one of the great philosophers and activists in American history. He said, well, we could say that the ignorant shouldn't vote or participate. Well, we would rather say no civilized state should have citizens too ignorant to participate in government. And this statement is just but a step to the fact that no state is civilized which has citizens too ignorant to help rule it. So soon as a nation discovers that it holds in the hearts of its citizens the vast mine of knowledge out of which it may build a just government, then more and more it calls those citizens to select their rulers and to judge the justice of their acts. So Du Bois, I want to leave it with him, a great, wise philosopher of an activist of collective intelligence, and may we all do our part to help realize the possibility of democracy in the next century. Thanks.
Thank you, Lex. And if I may, as a transition, say that if I combine your presentation with Jeff's earlier on, well, it's high time that we use the science of collective intelligence to better design government, right? To better design our collective interactions for smarter decisions. And yes, good point, Diana Samarasan, who will be with us later on. We will have a session on participatory philanthropy, who points out the need to include also people with disabilities. So I will jump forward. I was going to tell you a little bit. So speed forwarding to today's situation. So we know the challenges that democracy is facing. So if we want an agenda for how to inform public policy making thanks to collective intelligence, I'll jump forward. Some of you may be familiar with this quote, which justifies how you can make smarter decisions with more expertise, but also with greater diversity of participants. Now, one of the very summarized chapters in the book is about, well, what is collective intelligence, the science, and the drivers? Well, you see a summary here. It's familiar to you. You need more people. You need that diversity, but not just more people, more diverse people. And that's not enough. You could just bring all of us into a room. That doesn't mean we'll be collectively intelligent, as is obvious, but important to highlight. We need to deliberate well. We need to know the intention behind in order to be properly motivated, and depending on the task, have the proper motivation. And we need together whatever comes out of this. So, whatever emerges in our group interactions. And we can promote this and enhance it thanks to artifacts, the space around us, etc. So there are a number of drivers that we see across all the examples that have already been mentioned in the case studies in our book. Now, zooming through in a very simplified way, the challenge to democratic governance today is at least on four fronts. Many citizens feel, if you look at the World Values Survey and other polls in many countries that policymakers are not delivering, that the process is questionable, not necessarily fair or transparent, that they haven't had enough of an opportunity to make themselves heard, and that they may not be heard also at a deeper level, emotional level, values, aspirations, fears, etc. And this is something that potentially democracies are better equipped to do, but that we see around the world not necessarily delivering and being challenged by, I would argue, demagogues or even populists. So there is a marriage potentially in heaven between what collective intelligence properly fostered can deliver and what we need. And that magic is all the lines in the middle that you won't be able to check right now, but on many fronts, these are interconnected. The benefits of collective intelligence can answer the needs of today's or tomorrow's democracy. And that promise needs to be fulfilled. So the book is here to provide examples from India's public hearings for marginalized people to sophisticated working groups in Denmark between civil servants, politicians, and citizens, from using sophisticated chatbots in Brazil's Congress to fostering very carefully a safe space for dialogue among members of parliament around Europe, from Taiwan's very rich process of on and offline deliberations, etc. The case studies are rich. We have some which are not total successes. I see on my screen one of our contributors, Pierre Portevin, who writes about a case in Wallonia, which was very promising, started off very well, and then encountered some very real life problems. So that promise is not easy to fulfill. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Paulo Spada, who wrote with Lex a brilliant chapter on what does literature tell us about the impact, and is this promise fulfilled? Paulo.
So, yes, this chapter has an interesting genealogy because almost all of us, when we were discussing, we discovered that we have a sort of interdisciplinary background. We started in a field and then we moved to another. So when we tried to, we were envisioning a chapter about the evaluation of impact of collective intelligence, and there are many impact evaluation frameworks we could have chosen from. We really took the opportunity of the book and its freedom to try a sort of transdisciplinary approach, like to really try to go a little bit beyond the jargon of each discipline, because politics has analyzed a lot of participatory and deliberative process, psychology, computer science. We really tried to see if we could come up with a sort of primer that was about impact evaluation that was transdisciplinary, and this is a huge challenge. And so this is, you have to see this as a sort of first attempt at trying to create a sort of common language of how we can evaluate together these things, because more and more a single discipline is just not enough, right? We need 2, 3, often 4. It's pragmatic, and it's in part is really inspired by our practice in big grant, most of them Horizon 2020, but many others in which you have this huge consortium with like 26 partners, and some computer scientists, some psychologists. And there is so much lost in translation when people are discussing. People get confused because they have their own ideas and their own point of views, their own jargon. And so there is sort of a big inefficiency when we're trying to combine and break those silos. So, because the idea, this is not going to go deep in a single discipline, but it's going to really try to break silos, try to bring together disciplines that really rarely talk together. That was kind of the challenge we were trying to do. So I think this chapter is mostly useful from a person, obviously, a lay person that is not an academic, that is interested to see what's going on, what are the impacts that have been sort of recorded so far from the literature, and that's one type of audience. The other type is a specialist of one discipline that is looking instead to open up to all the other. So this is an example of, this is from my good friend, Brigitte Gessel, that she has done an impact evaluation framework for political science. And so as you can see, she's talking about input legitimacy, democratic process, effectiveness, and civic education. But the language is really rooted into sort of concepts that are contested, because all our social sciences uses contested concepts, and they're really rooted in politics. And here we tried really to think about, okay, as data collection points. That to us was one approach to really try to think, to eliminate all the possible jargon, in a sense. And so we thought about, okay, where is the data that we collect when we are analyzing this process? So there is a lot of data that is collected at individual level when we do the evaluation of this process. And that's the first type of studies and all the literature that you'll find in the chapter when you read about it. The typical type of study that focus on individual data collection, it's about impact on individual knowledge, individual skills, and civic skill, not just I learn more about climate change because I participated in a climate change citizen assembly, but I actually learned how to talk, I learned to do other things. That's the first sort of big family of processes. And we analyze all the variety of basically literature from computer science, management, politics. And you're going to see the kind of sort of interlinked stories and how the different disciplines are shedding some light, analyzing some angles of the individual sort of impacts. The second one is group level metrics. So we are really interested not just about the impact on the individual, but also how the group together creates, for example, novel information, or if preference polarized, or if they arrive to consensus. So there is a lot of growing literature around the quality of sort of group production. And this requires group level metrics. And the last one is effects on society as a whole, beyond the citizens that participated directly. This talks about transmission issues, knowledge, social, the impact on welfare, the impact on institutions and policies. Again, this is one attempt. It doesn't pretend to be the unique way you can slice this gigantic literature. But we really try to free ourselves from the sort of baggage, the disciplinary baggage that we were bringing to this book, and really try to think, okay, we're starting from an interdisciplinary approach, trying to combine the discipline. Let's see if we can go transdisciplinary. So the sources are around 200 articles. The disciplines are politics, economics, psychology, computer science, pedagogy, and management. These are the primary disciplines that we drew upon. And again, this is more of a starting point for a journey, as I said, than an actual endpoint. Our objective was also to really not just highlight best practices. I think that was one of the key conscious choice, and Stephen mentioned that some of the case studies are actually problematic case studies. And the same, you'll see that the impact evaluation sort of chapter was really focused to try to talk about not just success stories, because we think that one of the limits of the literature on the evaluation of all these practices, it's always that we have sort of bias toward best practices. And so you're going to see a lot of doubts and things that we could do better and ways that we could improve and cases that are failed, things that there are discussion about maybe regarding some type of key performance indicator in which we don't know enough, and and maybe they might be problematic the way we are analyzing them. And this is me, and I'm working at the University of Southampton, and I'm currently involved on 2 big projects that, again, are similar. Maybe some of you know Participedia. Participedia is a project that is a crowdsourcing project that tried to crowdsource qualitative case studies of participatory deliberative process, democratic innovation, collective intelligence process. I put it there because one of the things that we also included in the chapter is that we really tried not to limit ourselves to a sort of naturalist ontology. We also tried to combine other type of ontology. Collective intelligence is strongly rooted at the moment in a naturalist ontology, but there is also a lot of other studies that are more constructivist, and they have a sort of slightly different angle. Obviously, we couldn't do everything in a single chapter, but we really hope that this will be really a starting point, as a sort of starting point of thinking about impact evaluation. It has a very practical focus, and so it's also designed for people that are running grants right now and are thinking about impact evaluation, to go through the chapter and being inspired. Actually, I have various colleagues that are now using it for their own grant, because it gives a very good sort of initial overview of a sort of million direction that you can go with the impact evaluation. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Paolo. And let's keep some time for questions. I see lots of questions emerging in the chat, some that I'm burning to answer, and I'm sure my colleagues. So, Karina, looking to the future.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I would like to thank all contributors of the Handbook of Collective Intelligence for Democracy and Governance for the amazing work you have done together with us. I would also like to thank you for the audience here today, for your participation. And many of you, I guess, they are joining here today because also you recognize the need for testing and validating new models for democracy and governance. One of our basic assumptions for setting out and starting this editing of the handbook was really to respond to why we should leverage collective intelligence for democracy and governance now more than ever. So in the handbook, we respond to that statement by addressing the paradigm shift that humanity is encountering these years. We now stand at the brink of the 5th industrial revolution. And this new time, also referred to as the deep minds era, by Friedman 2019, is a time characterized by the harnessing of deep insights from human minds coupled with deep learning models from machines. And we will accordingly observe a wave of regulations and reinforcement of ethical standards to combine it all. There will be a growing need for meta thinking, and that is a need for reflecting on our thinking patterns and how we can think together with machines. New thinking processes that can lead to higher levels of consciousness for humanity if we do this right. So that is why I recently founded a hybrid intelligence world, which is a science, education, and tech integration platform backed legally by the IT University of Copenhagen. The idea of hybrid intelligence world is to transform organizations and society for higher level of collective consciousness between human and machines and bring new theories and technologies to the table on how we can balance human and machine intelligence with ethical standards for the better of organizations and humanity. So in my research over the years, I have also been interested in how we can extract tacit knowledge from both employees and citizens. Some of my work is inspired by Michael E. Polanyi as a scientist and who was actually one of the novel philosophers of the sciences in the 20th century. We can know more than we can tell. And all citizens accumulate tacit knowledge every day, such as farmers, workers, fishermen, and you name it, and civil servants. And they have all practical knowledge due to their social roles, which are relevant for policymaking. So if we should aggregate unconscious knowledge, we must then look to the implications of our cognition and cognitive models, models as human beings. The product of a tacit knowledge accumulation is a prediction or even an expectation about the future. Brain research shows that our cognitive systems constantly test errors from experiences in the past and present, but simultaneously draws on predictions about the future. So today, the prediction capability of citizens, if we look around, is not really utilized by governments for policymaking. So if governments and the policymakers could draw on such cognitive capabilities facilitated by AI as an early warning system, then they should be able to make more accurate judgments in lead time using this tacit knowledge as an updated and adjusting information for AI. AI and CI, they are impactful because they go beyond the individual intelligence, but do so in different ways. AI uses machine learning to scale and to become smarter as a collective, while CI aims to delve into the collective human intelligence and to make better decisions. So artificial intelligence can help scale collective intelligence for policymaking, and collective intelligence can help validate information generated by artificial intelligence for policymaking. So both AI and CI can then act in a symbiosis as a new navigating system for policymaking. And algorithms are as flawed as those who have built them, as we know, and they need regularly to be checked for biases and prejudice, and only collective intelligence can ensure that generated AI information can be validated for policymaking. So moreover, the rise of generative artificial intelligence can be seen as a worrying development. And this is also why we now need collective intelligence more than ever that can keep artificial intelligence ethical and human. And thank you so much for this. And please turn to hybridintelligence.world if you want to connect and know more about consciousness in the coming years. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Karina. So with that, we're going to open up to some questions. And this was a lot of content, but as you can tell, we can't refrain ourselves from